Archie Goodwin here. Welcome back to Riddle Stop. Now I could tell you today's story is about a dead watchman found in a cold storage locker, but that's like calling a February harbor a little chilly. 8 degrees on the thermometer, all night long, steady as a heartbeat, and a dead man's watch stopped at a time that had nothing to do with when he actually died. A terminal owner who walked into our office looking like the cold had already gotten to him too. A widow who knew her husband better than the harbor police ever bothered to. A foreman who smelled blackmail before anybody said the word out loud and paid for that nose with his own life in the channel. A shipping clerk who sold one page out of a ledger and then had to live with what that page cost. A rival terminal operator, warm as a summer dock, who volunteered exactly one detail too many about a case that was supposed to be closed. A locked room across the water that only one man held the key to. And a satchel that went in a great deal heavier than it came out. Inspector Kramer, for the record, spent the whole week convinced the weather was innocent. And then there's the detail nobody counted on. A spring-hinged door that could seal a man's fate without anybody ever having to touch the lock at all. So bundle up. This one's called Nero Wolfe and the Frostbitten Harbor. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Locker 14. It was a Saturday in February. The kind of Saturday that makes a man reconsider his loyalty to the city of New York, when Walter Ashgrove climbed the 7 steps to the Brownstone at 918 West 35th Street, with frost still clinging to his overcoat, and rang the bell like he meant to wake the dead. I let him stand there a moment. That's not cruelty, it's procedure. Fritz likes a look at anybody before the chain comes off, and I've learned to give him the time. Through the one-way glass panel, I watched Ashgrove stamp his feet on the stoop and blow into his cupped hands, and behind me in the hall I watched Diana's ears go up a full 2 seconds before the bell even rang. She'd heard him coming from the sidewalk, the quick, nervous clip of a man who doesn't like where he's about to go, and doesn't much like himself for going there. Caesar came to stand at my shoulder, unhurried, the way he does when he's already decided a visitor isn't a threat, just a nuisance the household will have to absorb. Mars stayed back by the office door with his ears up, because Mars trusts Caesar's judgment about 90% of the time and insists on double-checking the other 10. "Mr. Ashgrove," I said, opening the door at last, "you look like you walked here from the pole." "Might as well have," he said, and came in shaking, though I don't think all of it was the cold. He was a solid man in his 50s, the kind who'd built a business with his own back before he built it with other men's, and he had the particular grey look of somebody who hasn't slept properly in a couple of nights. Fritz took his coat and hung it with the brisk efficiency of a man who's decided already that this visitor won't be trouble, whatever the dogs might eventually determine. Loyal, who has an unshakable and entirely personal opinion about strangers who smell of fish, gave Ashgrove's trouser cuffs a long, thorough inspection and then sat down beside him anyway, which is Loyal's particular way of announcing that a man is honest at the core, even if he does carry the smell of the Fulton docks into a front hall. Minerva watched the whole business from halfway up the staircase, quiet, the way she does when she hasn't yet decided whether a person is worth watching further. I've learned over the years to treat Minerva's silences as a kind of open question, not a verdict. I took Ashgrove into Nero Wolfe, who was behind his desk with a glass of beer at his elbow and an expression that made it plain he already resented whatever this visit was going to cost him in interrupted afternoon light. It was not orchid hours, but Wolfe has a way of resenting interruptions on principle, whether or not there's anything at that particular moment to interrupt. "Mr. Wolfe," Ashgrove said, settling into the red leather chair the way a man settles who isn't sure he'll be asked to stay in it. "I own the Ashgrove cold storage terminal in Red Hook. 2 nights ago, one of my watchmen was found dead in locker 14, frozen through. The harbor police are calling it misadventure, say he locked himself in by accident and the cold did the rest. His widow doesn't believe that. Neither, if I'm honest, do I." Wolfe didn't look up from his beer. "Men die in cold rooms, Mr. Ashgrove, without any assistance from murder. It is regrettably one of the more mundane hazards of your trade." "Not holding this, they don't," Ashgrove said, and set something down on the desk blotter, a scrap of oilcloth, stiff with old frost, pale as bone, with a stamped mark on one corner, gone half illegible from handling. A shipping seal, from a line I didn't recognize, and from the look on Wolfe's face, neither did he. Desmond Kowalik was found with that balled up in his fist, so tight the harbor police had to pry his fingers open. That mark isn't on any manifest, that's crossed my terminal in 3 years. I run a clean operation, Mr. Wolfe, or I thought I did until 2 nights ago, and I want to know what my watchman found in my own terminal that was worth freezing him to keep quiet about." That brought Wolfe's eyes up off the beer glass. He doesn't often let interest show on that face, but I've been reading it across this desk for a good many years, and I saw it move, a narrowing, a stillness, the look of a man who has just been handed a puzzle piece that doesn't belong to the box he was told it came from. "Sit down properly," Wolfe said, which Ashgrove already had, "and give Mr. Goodwin the particulars from the beginning. All of them. I find half a story more tiresome than none at all." I got out my notebook and got the particulars. Desmond Kowalik, 41 years old, night watchman at the Ashgrove terminal for 6 years, married to a woman named Ruth, no children, well liked by the crew, methodical to the point of being teased about it. Found at approximately 5 in the morning by the relief watchman, sealed inside a sub-zero storage locker among stacked crates of frozen cod bound for a Fulton Street wholesaler. No sign of forced entry to the locker door, no sign, on the harbour police's first and apparently only glance, of violence. Just a man who by every outward appearance had gotten himself shut in on the coldest night of the year and hadn't lived to see the door opened again. "And the harbour police are satisfied with that account," Wolfe said. It wasn't really a question so much as a flat recitation of a fact he already found irritating on principle. "Satisfied enough to close the file inside of 2 days," Ashgrove said. "That bothers me almost as much as the oilcloth does, Mr. Wolfe. A man dies strangely in my terminal, and the whole matter's wrapped up before his widows even picked a hymn for the funeral." Diana, who had been lying near the fire with her chin on her paws through the whole recitation, lifted her head and looked at Ashgrove for a long, level moment. The particular look she gives people who are telling the truth but not the whole of it. I made a note of that the way I make note of everything Diana does with her ears and her eyes, because in 6 years of watching that dog work a room, I have never once seen her wrong about a man holding something back, even when the man himself hadn't fully admitted it to himself yet. Chapter 2. A Fee Worth Freezing For. Wolfe leaned back until the chair gave its familiar creak of complaint, closed his eyes and said nothing for the better part of a minute, which with Wolfe can mean either profound thought or profound disinterest, and there is frequently no telling which until he speaks again. "This is properly a matter for the harbour police," he said at last, "or, failing their competence, the district attorney's office. I fail to see what a private investigation would accomplish beyond confirming what is probably already true, that your watchman died a stupid, ordinary death in a cold room, and that scrap of cloth is an unfortunate coincidence he happened to be clutching." "I don't believe in that particular coincidence," Ashgrove said, "and neither, I think, do you, Mr. Wolfe, or you'd have shown me the door the moment I set that cloth on your desk, instead of asking Mr. Goodwin to write down every detail I gave him." I bit back a grin. The man had been in the room 12 minutes and he already had Wolfe's number, which is more than most visitors manage inside an hour. "The shipping mark," Wolfe said, tapping the oilcloth with one thick finger without troubling himself to pick it up, "belongs, as far as I can presently determine, to a line neither Mr. Goodwin nor I recognize, which in itself would be unremarkable. Coastal lines dissolve and reform constantly, particularly the smaller ones, and a stamp can outlive the company that cut it by years if nobody bothers to retire the die. What is remarkable, and what I confess holds my interest against my better judgment, is a dead man clutching such a thing as though it mattered to him more than his own hands, which by every account were bare in a room kept at 8 degrees. That's the detail that hasn't let me sleep since Thursday," Ashgrove admitted, and rubbed at his eyes in a way that told me he meant it literally. Wolfe was quiet again, and this time I recognized the quiet for what it was, the sound, if silence has a sound, of a man already 3 moves into a game he hadn't yet agreed to play. "Your fee," he said finally. "If I were to take this matter, and I have not yet agreed to take it, would need to account for the considerable disruption of investigating a death the city has already closed, which will require Mr. Goodwin's presence on a waterfront in February, an environment for which he has, by his own frequent admission, very little patience." "Name the figure," Ashgrove said, without so much as a blink. Wolfe named it. It was not a small figure, and I watched Ashgrove's face for the flinch that most clients give even when they intend to pay without argument. There wasn't one, which told me 2 useful things at once: that the terminal was turning a good deal more money than its books, likely showed the union's auditors, and that whatever was wrapped inside that oilcloth mattered to Ashgrove a great deal more than a single watchman's pension claim ever could have on its own. Wolfe considered the oilcloth again, turning the matter over the way he does when a detail refuses to sit quietly where he's put it. You said the harbour police found no sign of forced entry to the locker itself. Was there any indication of how the door came to be closed in the first place? A locker of that kind, I would presume, does not latch itself. What? It doesn't, Ashgrove said. It's a heavy steel door, spring-hinged, meant to swing shut and seal on its own once it's pushed past a certain point. Precisely so a man's hands full of crates don't have to fuss with a latch. Meant as a convenience. The harbour police took that as proof it was an accident. Door swings shut on its own, man stuck inside. Cold does the rest. A convenience, Wolfe repeated, that would serve equally well as a convenience for anyone wishing to seal a man inside without having to linger over the mechanism themselves. He fell silent again, and I recognized the particular quality of that silence, not idle thought, but the sound of a man setting one fact carefully beside another and finding for the first time that they fit. There's also his widow, Ashgrove said, almost as an afterthought, in the particular tone men use when they're finally getting around to the thing that's actually been eating at them the whole conversation. Ruth Kowalik. She came to my office the very morning after, before the harbour police had even finished their report, and told me flat out that her husband would never have let himself get locked in that room. Said he knew that terminal better than the men who'd built it, better than I do, if it comes to that. A wife's grief is not evidence, Mr. Ashgrove, Wolfe said, however sincerely felt and however accurate her assessment of her husband's competence. No, Ashgrove agreed, but his watch was found stopped at 11 minutes past 2, and the temperature log for locker 14 shows the compressor cycling steady through the whole night, same as always. A man doesn't freeze to death in 11 minutes in a room holding at 8 degrees, Mr. Wolfe. It takes hours I've had to learn about since Thursday morning, more than any man in my line of work ought to know. Somebody wants this to look like hours took him. I've come to believe they didn't. That, finally, did it. Wolfe drank the last of his beer, set the glass down on its coaster with the particular deliberate precision that means his mind is already 3 steps down whatever road he's chosen, and said, Archie, get your coat. It is, I understand from Mr. Ashgrove's evident suffering, cold on the waterfront.
It's cold everywhere this week, I said, but I take your meaning.
Chapter 3. The Fish House Circuit. It was cold on the waterfront, the particular way the inside of an icebox is cold. If the icebox had wind coming off open water and smelled permanently of herring, tar and diesel smoke. Red Hook in February is not a neighborhood that invites lingering, and I did not linger, except at the handful of places where lingering got me talked to, which took a good deal longer than I'd have liked. The Ashgrove terminal sat at the end of a pier that groaned under my feet, like it resented the extra weight of one more man in a wool coat. 3 stories of corrugated steel and frost-caked brick, with a loading dock where men in canvas coats moved crates with the particular grim economy of motion you learn when your hands are too cold to waste a single unnecessary gesture. Nobody there wanted to talk about cowlick indoors, under a roof that belonged, one way or another, to the man paying their wages. A broad, weathered foreman named Gil Farrow, a man who ran the shop steward's business for the local same as he ran the loading crew, with the same flat authority in both jobs, agreed to talk to me only once. We were both standing outside in weather that would have discouraged a polar bear, on the theory, as he put it, that walls in that terminal had ears that reported straight back to the front office. Desmond was careful, Farrow told me, his breath fogging thick between us. Careful men don't lock themselves in cold rooms, Mr. Goodwin. He'd worked nights there 5 years, 6 come spring, knew every latch and every hinge on that terminal better than the men who welded them on. Mr. Ashgrove says the same thing, near enough. Ashgrove, Farrow said, and left it sitting there in the cold air between us, which is a kind of answer all by itself, the sort that tells you more by what it withholds than by what it states. You saying Ashgrove had a hand in it. I'm saying a man doesn't get careless after 6 years, and I'm saying the harbour police didn't spend but 4 hours on the whole business before they called it misadventure and went home to their supper. Draw your own conclusions. I've got a crew waiting on me. I let Farrow go back to his crates and spent the better part of an hour after that walking the terminal itself, with Ashgrove's blessing, looking at locker 14 from the inside, a long steel room, cold enough that my breath hung in front of my face like something solid. Stacked floor to ceiling with crates of cod packed in ice and burlap. The latch, when I tried it from inside with the door propped, worked smooth and easy. No stiffness, no hesitation, nothing that would explain a careful man getting himself shut in by accident. I stood there a good deal longer than I needed to, mostly because I wanted to feel for myself exactly how fast the cold worked its way in through wool and leather, and by the time I let myself back out, my hands had gone stiff enough that I fumbled the latch twice, trying to reset it. A young dock hand named Petey, who couldn't have been more than 19, and who had clearly been sent by somebody to keep half an eye on me, mentioned as I was leaving that Kowalik had asked him, the week before he died, to cover the far end of the terminal alone for an hour some nights. No explanation given beyond $1 pressed into his hand, and a promise it wouldn't happen more than a few more times. Petey hadn't asked questions, being 19 and glad of the $1. He looked considerably less glad of it now, standing in the cold telling me about it. Did he say why, I asked. Said he had business, Petey told me, and business wasn't none of mine so long as the $1 kept coming. I didn't think nothing of it till he turned up dead. I thanked him, gave him $1 of my own for his trouble, which seemed to settle something in his conscience, and went to find a telephone to call the Brownstone before the cold finished the job on my hands that it had started on Kowalik's watch. I spent the rest of the afternoon on what I'd come to think of. By the third stop, as the fish house circuit, 3 separate cold storage outfits up and down that stretch of the Red Hook shoreline, a longshoreman's tavern called the Anchor Watch, where the beer was, if anything, warmer than the room itself, and a harbour master's office where a clerk with cold cracked knuckles let me look through manifest records going back 2 years for the price of a story about how I'd hurt my hand, which I invented on the spot, and which he seemed to enjoy considerably more than the truth would have been. The shipping mark on Ashgrove's scrap of oilcloth belonged, according to a retired customs inspector, I found nursing a whiskey alone at the Anchor Watch, to a coastal import outfit called the Narrows Trading Company, dissolved on paper, by his recollection, some 4 years back. Dissolved on paper, he said, with the particular relish of a man who spent 30 years watching paper lie to him professionally. Don't mean dissolved on the water, son. A company like that folds its name quiet and keeps right on running its boats, paints over the hull markings, picks up somebody else's manifest stamp, and nobody the wiser unless they go looking, which nobody much does in this trade unless they've got a reason. Somebody had a reason to keep that stamp alive. Then, somebody generally does, he said, and turned his glass a slow half-circle on the bar, which I took to mean the conversation, on his end, was drawing to a close. You want to know whose stamp it picked up next, you ask down at Bayfront, across the channel, and you ask careful, because that's not a friendly question over there. I made a note to visit Bayfront cold storage first thing in the morning, and I made a second note that my feet had gone from cold to something closer to a dull, distant numbness that I didn't much care for, and I made a third note, mostly to myself, that Nero Wolfe was at that very moment sitting in a heated brownstone with a plate of Fritz's cooking in front of him, while I froze on a waterfront for a fee that was, admittedly, going to turn out a very good one indeed. Before I called it a day, I made one more stop, at a chandlery 2 piers down from Ashgrove's terminal, where an old man named Careless sold rope and tackle, and from the look of his back room, a good deal of information to anybody who bought enough of the former to justify asking for the latter. Careless had known Kowalik to nod to for years, the way harbour men know each other without ever quite becoming friends, and he remembered something the customs inspector hadn't thought to mention, that in the 2 weeks before he died, Kowalik had taken to buying his tobacco at odd hours, well past midnight, from a stand near the bayfront side of the channel rather than the shop 3 blocks from his own front door. A man doesn't walk half a mile in February for tobacco. He can get closer to home, Careless said, unless the walk itself is the point of the errand. He wouldn't say more than that, and I got the impression he'd already said more than he'd meant to, but it was enough to tell me that whatever business Kowalik had been conducting in the weeks before his death, he'd been conducting it on Ranke's side of the water, not his own. Chapter 4. The Cast on the Ice. By the time I got back to the Brownstone that evening, half thawed and smelling faintly of herring myself, despite my best efforts, Wolfe had already summoned the rest of the cast, in the sense that he'd had Fritz place calls asking them, with impeccable and entirely misleading politeness, to come see him at their earliest convenience, which in Wolfe's private vocabulary means immediately, and preferably before supper. Ruth Kowalik came first, a small, composed woman in a grey coat who sat very straight in the red leather chair and answered every one of Wolfe's questions with the flat, careful precision of a person who has rehearsed her own grief thoroughly enough that she no longer has to feel it fresh in front of strangers. She confirmed everything Ashgrove had already told us, that her husband was careful, methodical, quietly proud of his work at the terminal, and added that he'd mentioned nothing unusual in the weeks before his death, except that he'd seemed, in her own word, watchful, in a manner that wasn't at all like him. He'd taken to walking a longer route home some nights, she said, and once she'd caught him standing at the front window past midnight, looking down at the street, though he'd claimed afterward he was only checking the weather. Diana lay near the widow's chair through the entire interview and did not once lift her head in suspicion, which told me a good deal more than the woman's careful sentences did. Gil Farrow came next, still in his work coat and smelling of the cold air outside, and repeated to Wolfe roughly what he'd told me on the pier that afternoon, with one addition he hadn't offered me outdoors, that Kowalik had asked him, some 10 days before his death, whether the union pension covered a man's family properly if he happened to come into a little money on the side before he retired. Farrow hadn't thought much of the question at the time, he admitted, chewing at the words as though they tasted sour going down. He thought a great deal of it now. A shipping clerk named Milo Trent arrived third, thin and sweating despite the cold he'd just come in from, and admitted reluctantly, and only after Wolfe let a silence stretch out long enough to make most men confess to sins they hadn't even committed yet, that a single page had gone missing from the terminal's manifest ledger the week before Kowalik died. He blamed it on filing error, a clerk's oversight, nothing more, and repeated the word oversight twice more than a man needs to when he's telling the truth. Apollo, who had been patrolling the hall in his restless, tireless way all evening, stopped dead in the office doorway and stared at Trent for a solid 10 seconds before moving on down the hall, and I have learned over the years to trust that particular stare of Apollo's more than I trust most, sworn testimony. Last of all came Otto Reinke, who ran the rival cold storage terminal across the channel at Bayfront, and who accepted Wolfe's invitation with a great and generous show of civic helpfulness that didn't sit right with me for reasons I couldn't yet properly name, though I've learned not to ignore that particular itch. He was a large, affable man, with an easy laugh and a handshake that lasted a beat too long, and he spoke of Ashgrove's misfortune with the sort of warm, sorrowful concern a man shows for a competitor's bad luck, when he wants everyone in the room to notice how gracious he's being about it. He mentioned, entirely unprompted and rather too casually, that he'd heard the harbour police had already closed the Kowalik matter for good, as though he wanted us to hear that particular fact twice, from 2 different directions, before he left. Caesar, who rarely bothers rising for visitors he's already privately decided are harmless, stood in the office doorway for the entire duration of Reinke's visit, and did not sit down once, not even when Fritz brought in the coffee tray. I mentioned, once Reinke had gone, the tobacco stand near the bayfront side of the channel, and the picture it suggested of a man who'd been crossing the water at odd hours for reasons that had nothing to do with cigarettes. Wolfe considered it with his eyes shut for a long moment. A man does not develop a taste for a particular brand of tobacco, sold only across a mile of freezing water, he said, unless something other than tobacco draws him there. It is consistent with blackmail, Archie, though it is equally consistent with a man conducting an honest inquiry of his own before he decided what, if anything, to do with what he'd found. I would rather know which before I commit myself to disliking the dead man. An interesting collection of people, on the whole, Wolfe said. Once Reinke had finally gone and Fritz had aired the office of a cologne that had lingered longer than its owner, a widow who is frightened rather than merely grieving, and grieving besides, a foreman who suspects blackmail and dislikes his employer more than he's willing to say outright, a clerk who has misplaced precisely the ledger page we most need to see, and a competitor who volunteers information nobody troubled to ask him for, twice over, as though he wished very much to be believed the first time. He closed his eyes. Archie, I believe tomorrow you will pay a visit to Bayfront Cold Storage. Chapter 5. Trouble at the Brownstone door. I never made it to Bayfront on my own preferred schedule, because at 7 the next morning the telephone rang with news that reshaped the whole matter considerably. Gil Farrow had been pulled dead out of the channel during the night, drowned, according to the First Harbour Police report, in an accident involving too much whiskey and an icy pier rail he'd apparently gone over in the dark. I doubted that account the way I doubt most convenient accidents in my line of work, and so, it turned out within the hour, did Inspector Kramer, who arrived at the Brownstone before 10 with snow melting on his hat brim and irritation written across his face in roughly equal proportion to the snow. 2 dead men connected to the same terminal inside 4 days, Wolfe, Kramer said, dropping his bulk into the chair. Farrow himself had occupied the previous evening, a coincidence I noticed, and Kramer mercifully did not. And I find out this morning you've had 4 different people off that waterfront sitting in this very office in the space of 2 days. That's not a coincidence I care for one bit. Nor do I, Wolfe said, which surprised Kramer into a genuine, if brief, silence. Mars, who has never cared for Kramer's habit of raising his voice inside these particular walls, stood by the office door with his ears forward for the whole of the visit, and Kramer, to his considerable credit after years of practice in this house, ignored him with the studied indifference of a man who long ago learned that arguing with a Doberman gets him precisely nowhere useful. The harbour police called Kowalik misadventure inside 2 days, Kramer said, taking out his notebook more from habit than any expectation of using it, and now Farrow's drowned in an accident nobody saw happen, on the same stretch of waterfront, 4 nights later. I've got a whole shoreline full of men who won't say 2 words to anybody wearing a badge, and a shipping company that supposedly folded 4 years back, that's apparently still running boats under somebody's borrowed stamp. You know something I don't, Wolfe, and I'd sooner hear it now than read about a 3rd man in the channel next week. Wolfe told him what we knew, which was considerably less than Kramer wanted, and considerably more than he'd walked in expecting, including the matter of the missing manifest page and Reinke's oddly eager helpfulness the evening before. He mentioned, too, the spring-hinged door at locker 14, and the fact that a man wishing someone sealed inside a cold room need never touch the mechanism at all, only push the body far enough past the threshold and let the door do the rest of the work on its own, which was, Wolfe observed, precisely the kind of detail that let a killer tell himself afterward that he hadn't really locked anyone in. The door had simply closed the way it always did. Kramer chewed on that a while before answering. That's a fine distinction for a man to make to himself at 2 in the morning with a body at his feet. Men make finer distinctions than that to themselves, under considerably less pressure, Wolfe said. It is, in my experience, the chief occupation of the guilty conscience, not the avoidance of the truth, but the careful management of exactly how much of it a man permits himself to look at directly. Kramer wrote almost none of it down, which is his particular way of pretending he'll forget it by morning, though in 20 years I've never once known him to actually forget anything Wolfe has told him in that office. I'll put a man on bayfront, Kramer said finally, rising and settling his hat back into place. Quiet as I can manage it. If Reinke's boats are carrying something under a dead company's stamp, I want to know precisely what, before your fee gets somebody else pulled out of that channel. After he'd gone, stamping the last of the slush off his shoes at the front door in a way that made Loyal watch him depart with visible and unconcealed relief. I told Wolfe I intended to go to Bayfront myself, that same afternoon regardless of Kramer's quiet man, on the theory that a competitor who volunteers unsolicited information about a closed police case, twice, in one evening, is a competitor who wants very badly to know how much we already know, and the only honest way to answer that particular question is to go stand on his own pier and look him in the eye while he tries to work it out. Chapter 6. What the Frost Remembers. Bayfront Cold Storage sat across the channel in a squatter, older building than Ashgrove's, its brick gone black with decades of coal smoke, and it took me the better part of an hour of standing around in weather that had, if anything, worsened, buying coffee for a dockhand who didn't want it, and inventing a story about a client's need for imported salmon storage, before anyone let slip a single thing worth writing down. What I got in the end was a locker number, locker 6, at the far coldest end of Bayfront's storage row, and a foreman's offhand, half-guilty remark that nobody but Reinke himself had ever been issued a key to that particular door, not in the 4 years the man had worked there. I reported all of it to Wolfe that evening over a plate of Fritz's chicken, along with the full temperature log Ashgrove had given us for locker 14 covering the night Kowalik died. Wolfe spread the log flat across his desk after dinner and studied the columns of figures with the particular, Total stillness that means his mind has finally found the thread it's been groping for since Ashgrove first sat down in that chair. The compressor cycled entirely normally all through the night, he said at last, tapping the page. Steady at 8 degrees, precisely as Mr. Ashgrove told us at the outset, and precisely as the log confirms. And yet Cowell's watch stopped at 11 minutes past 2. He set one thick finger against the entry. A man exposed to a temperature of 8 degrees does not die within minutes, Archie. Hypothermia, at that temperature, for a healthy man reasonably dressed for the work he does, requires several hours at an absolute minimum before it becomes fatal, and very considerably longer than that before it becomes fatal without a struggle severe enough to leave marks on a body. Cowellec, by every account we have received, was found with no such marks. So he wasn't frozen to death in that locker at all, I said, watching it come together the way it does when Wolfe hands you the last piece and lets you set it in yourself. He was very likely already dead, or unconscious well past any hope of recovery. At the moment he was placed there, Wolfe said, the cold did not so much kill him as erase, methodically and almost completely, the evidence of whatever actually did. It is an old trick, Archie, dressed up in a fairly modern refrigeration plant. A body left in ordinary conditions tells a story, through decay and the steady loss of heat, that a competent examiner can read with some confidence as to both time and cause. A body frozen through from the very start of the process tells almost nothing at all, and what little it does tell arrives already badly confused by the cold itself. Which means the watch stopping at 11 past 2 isn't when he actually died. It's just when the cold finally stopped the works, whatever hour that turned out to be. Precisely so. Someone wanted a very specific window of time, firmly established in the record, and the watch was meant, deliberately, to establish it. It very nearly succeeded. Wolfe closed his eyes. Archie, I want you and Saul to find some legitimate reason to be admitted into Bayfront's locker 6. If Reinke keeps that door locked against everyone in his own employment but himself, it holds either the contraband in question or evidence of it, and quite possibly, given his evident nervousness, both at once. I telephoned Saul that same night. He answered on the second ring, as he generally does, as though he'd been sitting by the instrument expecting my call before I'd finished dialing it. Saul and I spent the better part of the following day working Bayfront from opposite ends. The way we've learned to over the years. I took the front, asking fool questions about salmon storage until the foreman started avoiding me on sight, and Saul took the back, which mostly meant he simply stood in places long enough, and quietly enough, that men forgot he was there at all and talked past him as though he were a coil of rope. What Saul came back with, over coffee at a diner 2 blocks from the pier, was worth the whole cold day. Reinke, it turned out, made a habit of visiting locker 6 alone, always after the regular shift had gone home, always carrying a satchel that was heavier going in than it was coming out. One of the night men, a boy of about 19, who Saul had spent an hour buying pie for, said he'd seen Reinke down there the very night Cowellec died, hours later than Reinke's usual habit, moving something heavy enough that he'd had to prop the door with his shoulder rather than his hand. He didn't think anybody clocked him, Saul said, on account of the night man was down at the far end of the building nursing a bad tooth, but the boy saw him come up the stairs after, breathing hard, and said Reinke wasn't a man who breathed hard over a satchel, not normally. I brought all of it back to Wolfe, along with the temperature log, and it was that detail, a heavy satchel, a propped door, a man breathing hard on a night colder than any other that winter, that Wolfe set beside the compressor figures, and turned over in his mind until the shape of the whole thing came clear. Chapter 7. Questions in the Deep Freeze.
Saul and I did not, in the end, need to force our way into locker 6, because Wolfe had a considerably better idea, which was simply to make Otto Reinke walk in there himself, in front of witnesses, on a pretext he couldn't easily refuse without confirming everything by the refusal alone.
Wolfe summoned Reinke back to the Brownstone 2 evenings later, along with Ashgrove, the widow, and Milo Trent, on the announced grounds that he had reached certain provisional conclusions and wished to share them with the interested parties before informing Inspector Kramer of the full particulars. It was of course a trap, and not a particularly subtle one, but subtlety has never much troubled Wolfe, when the honest alternative is waiting patiently for a jury that may never convene. The dogs took up their positions, as they always do when the office fills with strangers whose intentions haven't yet been sorted. Caesar stationed by the door, entirely unmoving, Mars near Wolfe's desk, alert to every shift of weight in every chair, Apollo circling the room once, twice, before finally settling by the window with his ears still working, Minerva on the stairs, watching the whole proceeding through the rail with her particular patient interest. Diana pressed close against Ruth Kowalik's chair, exactly as she had been from that very first interview days before. Loyal, steady at my side, as he always is, warm and solid and unbothered by anything short of an actual raised fist. "I have established," Wolfe said, once everyone was seated and thoroughly uncomfortable in the way his office manages to make even innocent men, that Desmond Kowalik was dead, or dying beyond hope before he was ever placed in locker 14, and that his watch was stopped quite deliberately to suggest a time of death several hours later than the truth of the matter. I have also established that a nominally defunct shipping concern, the Narrows Trading Company, continues in fact to move cargo under a resurrected stamp, the identical stamp, gentlemen, found pressed into the oilcloth Kowalik was clutching when he was discovered. Reinke's affable expression did not so much as flicker, but his hands folded loosely in his lap, tightened perceptibly enough that I noted it in the margin of my own thoughts, if not my notebook. "Mr. Reinke," Wolfe went on, unhurried, "you maintain a locker at your own terminal, locker 6, to which you alone hold a key, issued to no one else on your payroll in 4 years. I confess I would be curious to know precisely what it contains, since I understand from Mr. Farrow, before his own unfortunate accident on the Channel, that Kowalik had grown noticeably watchful in the weeks preceding his death, and a watchful man in this particular trade generally watches his competitors' storage rooms, not his own employers." "I've no earthly idea what you're implying," Reinke said, his easy laugh conspicuously absent now, "but I've cooperated fully with every question put to me since the moment. You volunteered, entirely unasked, that the harbour police had closed the Kowalik matter to their satisfaction," Wolfe said, cutting through the protest without raising his voice at all. "You mentioned it twice, in point of fact, on your first visit to this office. A man merely sympathetic to a rival's misfortune does not typically know, let alone announce twice over, the precise and current status of a police file concerning another man's employee, unless the status of that file happens to concern him rather more directly than sympathy alone would explain." Milo Trent, seated nearest the window, had gone the exact color of the frost on the glass behind him, and it was Trent, not Reinke, who finally broke first under the accumulated weight of the silence Wolfe let stretch out across the room. "I only took the page," Trent said, his voice cracking clean in half on the last word, "because Reinke paid better for it than the ledger job ever did. And then Desmond found out about the whole arrangement, and he wanted a cut of it too. And I told him straight out that Reinke wasn't the kind of man you went to asking for a bigger share." Chapter 8. The Second Locker. Reinke was on his feet by then, and Caesar was on his an instant later, and there is something about 75 pounds of coal-black Doberman rising unhurried to block a doorway that tends to end most arguments before they've properly gotten themselves started. Reinke looked at the dog, looked at Wolfe, and sat back down without another word of protest. "Finish it," Wolfe said to Trent, not unkindly, which is about as close as Wolfe generally allows himself to come to gentleness with a badly frightened man who has finally decided to stop lying. Trent finished it in pieces, the halting way men do when the worst part of a secret finally comes loose after being held too tight for too long. The Narrows Trading Company's boats, running quietly under Reinke's own private arrangement, had for something close to 2 years been moving smuggled cigarettes and, more recently and more lucratively, stolen furs, all of it packed inside otherwise entirely legitimate frozen cargo bound for both terminals, the extreme cold of the shipment serving a double purpose, masking the contraband from any casual inspection and discouraging any dockhand from digging too deep by hand into crates nobody particularly wanted to unload in a sub-zero room longer than absolutely necessary. Kowalik had come across a crate at Ashgrove's own terminal that didn't match its declared manifest weight, torn back just enough oilcloth to see what was actually hidden inside, and instead of reporting the discovery to his own employer, as an honest man in a different set of circumstances might have, had gone quietly across the channel to Reinke, hoping to buy his own silence with a cut of whatever profit was moving through those crates. He wanted money, plain and simple, Reinke said finally, flatly, all of his earlier warmth gone out of his voice entirely, the way heat goes out of an open cold room door in a matter of seconds. He came across to my terminal, right into locker 6 itself, and made his demand there in front of me, bold as anything, like a fool who'd never once considered what kind of men he was dealing with. I told him I'd think it over. "You struck him," Wolfe said. It was not phrased as a question. He grabbed at my coat when I turned to walk off. I hit him harder than I ever meant to. He went down against the crates and didn't get back up, and I stood there in that cold room and I panicked, plain and simple, Reinke stopped himself there and didn't finish it. "And you carried him back across the channel that same night?" Wolfe finished for him, without any particular satisfaction in his voice, only a kind of methodical completeness, and placed him in locker 14 rather than your own locker 6, precisely so that whatever evidence eventually surfaced would point to Ashgrove's terminal and not to yours. You stopped his watch yourself, deliberately, to fix a time in the record that would place you elsewhere entirely. Farrow, unfortunately for you both, later worked out enough of the truth on his own to make himself a second and considerably more dangerous liability. For a moment, nobody in the office spoke at all. Even Fritz, who had come to the doorway with the coffee tray and stopped there rather than interrupt, stood perfectly still. Ashgrove, in his chair, had gone pale in a way that told me he was only now understanding how close his own good name had come to being buried under Reinke's arrangement. His terminal, his locker, his watchman found dead among his own crates of cod. Every circumstance pointing away from Bayfront and toward Red Hook, precisely as Reinke had planned it to. "You'd have let Ashgrove's whole operation take the blame," Ashgrove said, finding his voice at last, low and furious in a way I hadn't heard from him all week. "My terminal, my man, my name in the harbour police file for the rest of my life, and you sitting across the water counting your money." Reinke didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would have helped him, and he seemed by then to know it. Reinke said nothing further, and there was nothing left, by that point, that needed saying. Saul Panzer, who had been standing quietly by the hall door for the entirety of the evening, in the unremarkable, forgettable way that has made him the finest shadow working in 3 boroughs, went to the telephone without being asked and put in the call to Inspector Kramer, while across the room Diana, for the first time all evening, finally laid her head down flat against Ruth Kowalick's knee. Chapter 9. The Thaw. Kramer arrived inside the half hour, snow still melting on the shoulders of his overcoat, and took the confession, and Reinke and Trent along with him, out into the cold with considerably less ceremony than he'd have liked to show, given the size of the audience gathered to watch it happen. Smuggling under a dead company's stamp, Kramer said to Wolfe before he finally left, shaking his head in the particular weary way he does when a case turns out uglier, and at the same time plainer than he'd expected in the same breath. 2 men dead over stolen cigarettes, and a handful of fur coats packed in cod crates. I'll say this much for that waterfront. Wolfe, it never once runs short of new ways to freeze a man to death that don't actually involve the weather at all. He tucked his notebook away, though he still hadn't written more than 2 lines in it the whole visit. I've seen men shot, stabbed, poisoned, and pushed off rooftops in this job. And I'll admit there's something about a man using the cold itself as a weapon that sits worse with me than most of it. A knife's got some heat behind it, at least anger, greed, something a man feels while he's doing it. This was just arithmetic. 8 degrees, so many hours, a door that shuts itself, cold as the crime it committed. It is, in that respect, a peculiarly modern sort of murder, Wolfe said. For all that men have doubtless been freezing inconvenient bodies since the first winter any of them survived. The machinery is new. The patience required to use it is not. The weather, Wolfe said, was merely the tool Mr. Reinke happened to find lying closest to his hand at the moment he needed one. Men have always made use of whatever the season chooses to offer them for such purposes. In summer he might well have used the river itself. In winter he used the cold instead, and very nearly succeeded in letting the cold take the entire blame. After Kramer had gone, taking Trent and Reinke with him into the weather, Ruth Kowalick sat on a while longer in the red leather chair, not composed now, finally, but crying openly, in the plain, unguarded way. She apparently hadn't allowed herself in front of any stranger until the strangers in question had finally stopped needing her to be strong for the sake of their own questions. "He wanted the money for me," she said at last, to no one in the room in particular. That's the part of it I can't sit easy with. He wasn't a greedy man, Mr. Wolfe, not ever. Not in 11 years of marriage. He only wanted enough set aside that I wouldn't have to take in other people's washing if anything ever happened to him out on that pier. He was, by every account we have gathered, Wolfe said, an honest man who made a single dishonest choice under a pressure most men never have cause to feel, and paid for that one choice a great deal more than it was ever worth, which was as close to open comfort as Wolfe generally permits himself to venture, and which seemed, from the way her shoulders finally eased, to have been exactly the sentence she'd been waiting for somebody to say plainly aloud. Before she left, she asked Wolfe one more question, quietly, the kind a person only asks once they've stopped needing to be brave in front of an audience. She wanted to know whether her husband had suffered. Wolfe considered his answer with more care than he gives most questions. The evidence suggests he was struck and rendered unconscious quickly, he said, and very likely never woke again once he was moved into the cold. I would not call that a mercy, Mrs. Kowalik, because there is no mercy in murder, but it is, as these things go, very nearly the least cruel version of what might have happened to him, and I see no profit in telling you otherwise when the truth happens to be kind enough to tell on its own. She thanked him for that, in a voice that had gone steadier than it had been all week, and let Fritz see her out into a night that had, for the first time in days, stopped snowing. Ashgrove paid the agreed fee the following morning without a word of argument, and with something close to visible relief in his handshake at the door. The particular relief of a businessman who has just learned his terminal was the unwitting scene of a crime, rather than the source of one, which for a man in his position amounts to nearly as much comfort as innocence itself. Gil Farrow's own death took a little longer to settle properly, since a drowned man's family deserves better than a shrug and an open file, and Kramer, to his credit, didn't give them one. It came out over the following week, through a longshoreman who'd finally decided the cold had gone on long enough without the truth coming with it, that Farrow had confronted Reinke directly 2 nights before his own death, having worked out on his own that Kowalik's talk of money on the side pointed straight across the channel. Reinke hadn't struck him the way he'd struck Kowalik. He'd simply waited until Farrow had had enough to drink at the anchor watch to make a fall from an icy pier look like exactly what it was meant to look like, and then he'd let the harbour do the rest of the work for him, the same as he'd once let the cold do it. 2 men, 2 different tools, the same patient willingness to let the season take the blame. He was a careful man in his own way, Kramer said of Reinke, when he stopped by the Brownstone to close out the last of the paperwork, just careful about the wrong things. Most murderers are, Wolfe said. It is generally what separates the ones we catch from the ones we don't. Not their carefulness, but the particular thing they were careful about. Milo Trent, for his part, cooperated fully enough with the district attorney's office that Kramer told us he expected the clerk to serve a shorter sentence than his part in 2 men's deaths might otherwise have earned him. I couldn't work up much sympathy for a man who'd sold a ledger page for pocket money and then watched 2 people he'd worked alongside die without saying a word until a Doberman was standing in the doorway to help him find his conscience. But Wolfe pointed out, not unreasonably, that fear and greed rarely announce themselves as separate things to the man feeling them, and that Trent's cowardice, however contemptible, hadn't itself killed anybody. He is guilty of selling information, Wolfe said, and guilty, more gravely, of silence after he understood what that information had cost. Those are real crimes, Archie, and the law will weigh them as such, but they are not Reinke's crimes, and it does neither justice nor the dead any good to blur the two together simply because Trent's conduct offends you more than Reinke's does at this present moment, on account of Reinke having already answered for his. I let it drop there because Wolfe was right, as he generally is about the difference between a crime and a failure of nerve, even when I'd rather stay angry at both in equal measure a while longer. Some cases end clean, with one villain and one clear reckoning. This one had ended with a murderer, a coward, a dead man who'd made one bad choice, and a widow left to sort out which of the 3 she was allowed to grieve and which she wasn't, and I suspected she'd be sorting that out a good deal longer than any of the rest of us would spend thinking about it at all. Chapter 10. Warm again on 35th Street. I came home that evening to a brownstone that smelled gloriously of nothing whatsoever like herring or harbour fog, only Fritz's kitchen, where something involving duck was clearly well underway, filling the whole front hall with a warmth. I hadn't fully appreciated until I'd spent the better part of a week doing without it. Fritz wouldn't say what that duck was ultimately destined to become, only that it wasn't destined for anybody's supper table that particular night, which is Fritz's way, and always has been, and I stopped asking him to explain it years ago. Caesar met me at the door the way he always does, unhurried and entirely certain of his welcome, and Loyal fell into step at my side as I hung up my coat, still faintly, stubbornly cold at the edges, despite 3 straight days spent mostly indoors. Diana had already claimed her customary spot by the fire, and didn't so much as lift her head at my arrival, which after the week we'd all had felt like the highest possible compliment. Minerva watched from the stairs with the particular quiet satisfaction of a dog who has personally decided the household is, for the present moment at least, entirely and thoroughly safe. Mars and Apollo were arguing good-naturedly over a spot on the hearth rug that was by any reasonable measure available to either of them, plainly big enough for both. Wolfe was in his chair with a beer at hand, and an orchid catalogue he'd been shamefully neglecting all week in favour of frozen watchmen and dissolved shipping companies, and he looked for the first time since Ashgrove had ever climbed those 7 frosted brownstone steps, like a man who had finally gotten his own afternoons back where they properly belonged. "A tidy case in the end," I said, dropping into my own chair with a sigh I'd been saving up for days, once you finally got around to thawing it out properly. "An ugly case," Wolfe said, without looking up from the catalogue, "dressed up carefully as an accident, which is the ugliest variety there is, Archie, because it very nearly succeeded in convincing every single person whose professional business it was to doubt it on sight. Kramer included." Kramer included, Wolfe agreed, with something that might, in a considerably more expressive man than Nero Wolfe, have fairly been called satisfaction. I thought about Ruth Kowalik, and about a man who had walked a cold pier every single night for 6 years running because it was honest work and he was proud of doing it honestly, and who had made one bad choice on one particularly bad night, and paid for that choice with a great deal more than his own life. I thought, too, about how the coldest nights of any given winter are somehow always the ones that freeze the truth in place exactly as it stood at the moment it happened, patient as ice, waiting quietly for somebody stubborn enough to eventually come along and thaw the whole business back out into the light. Loyal rested his head on my knee, warm and solid, and entirely uninterested in shipping manifests, or frozen lockers, or anything at all in the wide world beyond the fire in front of him, and the plain fact that I was finally home again. I scratched behind his one-notched ear, and let the Brownstone settle back, at its own unhurried pace, into the rhythm it always manages to find again, sooner or later, no matter how cold the case that had come knocking through the front door. Fritz came in a while later with the beer Wolfe hadn't asked for but would have complained about the absence of, and lingered a moment in the doorway, the way he does when he has something on his mind that isn't strictly kitchen business. "The widow," Fritz said. "Mrs. Kowalik? Will she manage, do you think?" It wasn't the kind of question Fritz asked often, and I gave it the kind of answer it deserved rather than the quick one that would have sent him back to his stove satisfied. "She's got a settlement coming from Ashgrove, and a straight answer about what happened to her husband, which is more than most widows in her position ever get. I don't know that it makes up for the man, Fritz. Nothing would. But it's better than what she had a week ago, which was nothing but a police file that called it an accident, and expected her to be satisfied with that." Fritz nodded slowly, the way he does when an answer has satisfied some private accounting of his own, and went back toward the kitchen, pausing only to scratch Minerva behind the ears on his way past, which she permitted with the particular gracious tolerance she reserves for Fritz alone among the household's humans. Wolfe, still deep in his orchid catalogue, spoke without looking up. "Mr. Ashgrove's fee, once it clears, should keep the household comfortably through the worst of this cold snap, Archie, which I am reliably informed by the almanac has some weeks yet to run." "Is that your way of telling me to stay indoors a while?" "It is my way of observing," Wolfe said, turning a page, "that a man who has spent the better part of a week on a February waterfront has earned the right to a few evenings by this fire before duty calls him out into it again." I couldn't argue with that, and for once I didn't try. I sat where I was, with Loyal's head heavy and warm against my knee, and the fire doing its steady work against a cold that had, for the length of one case, very nearly gotten away with murder, and let the evening go on being exactly as ordinary, and as comfortable as it had any right to be.